Yet at the same time, it's interesting because Morris is far more flexible and far more nuanced in his perspective of especially Leviathan.
Well, g'day. It is Ken Colson here, Creation Unfolding. We have got Dr. Marcus Ross again with us. Interesting topic today on Behemoth in the book of Job. So, Marcus, welcome back. Great to see you. How you doing?
Hey, doing great. Thank you so much, Ken, for having me back again. This is always a treat to be on your channel.
Good. Great to have you. It was good to see you at Origins. So,
Indeed.
for those of you who don't know, we had our Origins 2025 meeting, which is kind of a technical creationist a session that we do once a year. We have like a biology, a geology, and a theology areas get together and kind of chew the fat on different theological issues and scientific issues. And so saw Marcus there as well as a bunch of other people. So that was great. In fact, what we're going to talk about today was presented there. Marcus, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're going to do today? First of all,
Oh.
put in a plug, man. Tell us about yourself and Cornerstone. Always do that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, for those who might not have seen or heard of me before, hi everyone. My name is Marcus Ross, and my background is paleontology. I'm a fossils and rocks guy. I taught for 16 years at Liberty University from 2005 to 2021. I was the director of the Center for Creation Research, the director of the Center for Creation Studies there, and I remain a fellow of the studies now. But in 2021, I stepped out of my full-time teaching mode that I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life doing. And my wife and I had started a science supply company. It grew to the point where, we decided to step out and run it full time. So after being an academic for a decade and a half, I still like being an academic. I think of myself that way, but I'm a business guy now, and our company is Cornerstone Educational Supply. My wife calls us the stuff people. We make science supply kits for distance learners and homeschoolers, whether that's high school or college or even elementary school stuff. Uh, it's everything under the sun in terms of science. We've got biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, and loads of earth science. As you know, Ken, you and I both really have a passion for the earth sciences. We love geology, and I wanted to be able to bring the sorts of kits that we would use in our university classes to homeschool applications. So that was kind of the first place that we started, and since then we've ballooned out into everything else: chemicals, dead animals, brass weights, optics. I mean, it's pretty wild. All the stuff that I now get to do in the place that I call work. Behind me here is my office at Cornerstone Educational Supply. So that's what we do. Anybody who's interested in the US who would like supplies can find us at cornerstone-edsupply.com. It's cornerstone-edsupply.com.
Great. All right. So, what do we talk? What do we do? We're doing Job. What's the deal today?
That's right. We have a job to do, is what we got going on here. But no, it was great catching up with you at Origins, Ken. Always really fun to get to that meeting. And as you mentioned, it's a technical meeting for creationists. And we've got three different groups that meet there. We've got our Creation Biology Society, our Creation Geology Society, and our Creation Theology Society. So those are the three that meet. And this year, I and a theologian by the name of Dustin Burlett team together to write up and present some new ideas and perspectives on what Behemoth and Leviathan may be, and to challenge a little bit within our own camp the assumptions that we have about their identities. So, for young Earth creationists, we almost always hear that Behemoth and Leviathan are dinosaurs or prehistoric reptiles of some kind. It's ubiquitous across the board. All the major ministries, every book that I've ever read, going through the literature, I only ever have found in the creation literature one small writing that questioned whether or not Behemoth was a dinosaur, for example, and Leviathan being some sort of sea reptile Cretaceous, Jurassic marine reptile, or some major crocodilian that's now extinct. So these ideas of prehistoric or extinct organisms are just, found everywhere in young Earth creationism, both from the lay level sorts of things that you find if you go to a museum or you're reading a kid's book, all the way up through the technical literature of young Earth creationists. And so over the years, I've gotten a little more skeptical of that perspective. And there were some aspects about the book of Job that started to, I think, push me in a different direction. That I think we're pushing back against this idea of dinosaurs and prehistoric reptiles. And it started in the advanced creation studies class that I taught at Liberty University, Creation Studies 390. The first couple of years that I taught that, I co-taught it with an Old Testament professor, Dr. Alan Furr. And he's likewise a young Earth creationist. And he went down the Grand Canyon, for example, with Canyon Ministries and loved and enjoyed it. And he was a great co-professor. But the first thing that he told me was something that kind of stuck with me for a while, and that was something about Job's tail. We'll get to that. Not Job's tail, sorry, Behemoth's tail. It might not be a tail. And I was like, really? Because like, isn't the word tail? He's like, yeah, but some people think that it's actually meaning something different. And that got me, kind of thinking. And the more that I started looking into it, I started getting a little less convinced over time. And a big turning point for me would be a few years ago. I was at the Evangelical Theological Society, and one of the presenters was Dr. Dwayne Garrett. He teaches Old Testament at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky. And he's a Job scholar, and he was had been working on a Job commentary for many years. He taught at the Masters University before that. And his perspective on Job was looking at them as like these composite, almost apocalyptic types of creatures, similar to what you would have in the book of Daniel, or similar to the creatures that are described in the book of Ezekiel, and similar in some ways to, later on in Revelation. And as he was describing it, I'm thinking, wow, there's some very different options on the table for us. And so part of the impetus for writing this is to push our own community to consider the text of Job more carefully than what we, I think, have in the past, to question whether or not we're right about the issue of dinosaurs or prehistoric reptiles. And I don't think that we are. I think that this is something else. And third, to kind of, okay, if that's not the case, what are the options that are on the table? Where does the text seem to be drawing us? So that's kind of the layout as we go through with what you and I are going to talk about today. It's kind of, yeah, what's the text trying to do? The interpretations of Behemoth and Leviathan are dependent on what the text is doing. And then once we've got an idea of what those might be, what are our options for it? And should we be thinking in terms of prehistoric reptiles?
Yeah.
So I think what might be helpful is if I show some folks here a little bit about what's going on in the passage right before Behemoth and Leviathan. So the real question that we have here is, why is God talking about Behemoth and Leviathan in the first place? What is it that has God speaking to Job, right? We think about the book of Job and we get the beginning point where there's this scene in heaven of what's going on between God and the Satan. And this then relates down to what's going on with Job. And he is, obviously has the worst of terrible situations befall upon him: the loss of his wealth, the loss of his family, the loss of his health, all in this cosmic wager that seems to be going back and forth between God and the Satan. And then you get his three friends that come in, and there's this long, almost like Hebraic rap battle that happens
Mm-hmm.
as you go from Job and his laments, his friends challenging him on what, basically the way the world works, and that the way the world works is good people get good things and bad people get bad things. It's a retribution level understanding of justice. And this is the most common perspective in all of human history,
Mm-hmm.
is that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. We expect that to be the case. And Job, on the other hand, is saying, but I'm a good person and bad things are happening to me. And they're saying, well, it's because of sin. He's like, no, it's not. And it gets, it gets pretty rough, actually. The friends become more and more frustrated because they feel like Job is just you know, stubborn and unwilling to state that he is a sinner. And as we go through, Job's complaints basically fall into kind of two big categories. And one is that the world is mismanaged. Things aren't happening the way that they ought to happen. Again, thinking in terms of this retribution principle. And a key part and kind of an outflowing is that evil flourishes. So, like, bad things are happening to me when I didn't do bad things. The world is a crazy place. And God is allowing evil to just run rampant. And we look at people who are evil and they get good things out of it. God is not doing a good job running the world for these reasons. And so we get the rap battle that happens in laying all of this out. And then God responds in the whirlwind after a brief interlude by a guy we didn't know was around, Elihu. Um, and what's really interesting is that God's responses come in the form of two distinct speeches. And the first of those is all about God's management of the world, both the physical and the biological aspect of how the world operates is what God is talking about. He's talking about the movements of the heavens. Do you understand, Job, where this, that, or the other thing happens? Have you any knowledge of what occurs here? And of course, the answer in all of these is no. It's this rhetorical barrage. I mean, it's just salvo after salvo of God exposing Job's absolute ignorance about the workings of the world. Again,
Mhm.
first physical, and then God goes through like this whole, zoological treatise with a whole bunch of organisms that are outside of human control. You've got wild animals, you've got lions, you have ostriches, although that word might not be ostrich, it could be a different bird. But the idea here, we got hawks and eagles, we've got wild ponies, wild oxen, and humans have no control over this. And God's like, I got it. I know when they're calving, I know when they're having their kids, I know where their food is. And you don't know any of this. Yeah. Then we have a break and God comes back and says the same thing to Job again of the gird your loins things, right? Get ready, be prepared, because I've got some questions for you. But instead of actually a whole bunch of questions, instead, the second time around, God starts describing these two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And after he's done with that, Job is moved to worship. Um, after the first speech from God, Job is moved to the point where he's like, I'm going to shut up now. I put my hand over my mouth. He says literally. It's
Mhm.
probably kind of a legal thing of I'm not going to challenge any of the points that have been made. But it doesn't change his heart. And so the second speech comes in, and Job is once again laid bare that he has no control over these creatures. In fact, no human has any control over these creatures whatsoever. Only God can manage these things. And at the end of that, Job is moved to absolute worship. And God even instructs him to give the sacrifices for his friends because he won't accept the sacrifices of his friends unless Job is praying for them. God's so irritated with them. And then we get the restoration. So this setup here, two challenges, two speeches. And what do we see in the beginning of God's second speech here? What we see is this. Now, the Hebrews often wrote in these sorts of paralleled systems. This is poetry. God's speech to Job is structured in terms of poetry with thought and thought kind of balanced. But it also is a chiasm. That is, it's a series of statements where the center statements have the most emphasis. This is what you should be getting out of all of this. For example, the flood narrative in Genesis 7 and 8 is likewise built on one of these chiasms where basically the events of the first half of the flood are mirrored by the retreating phase of the flood in various ways. And the hinge point for that narrative is God remembered Noah. That's the one thing you're supposed to get out of the whole flood narrative is that God saves Noah and his family.
Mhm.
So likewise, here we have a much smaller thing of just several verses, verses 9 through 14. And we can see a little bit of this with A. Do you have an arm like God? And then you go all the way down to the bottom to A prime, that your own right hand will save you. So we see that there's a parallel between arm and hand in some way. The next one, the B and the B prime. Can you thunder with a voice like God? And even I will praise you. So vocalizations are mirrored. And it happens in each one of these with the F and F prime being the center. Seeing each proud one and humble him, see each proud one and bring him low. So these ones are right next to one another. And that's because they're at the center of this chiasm. They're kind of the fulcrum of God's speech here. And this means that as we look at these verses, these are the ones that are setting up what God is going to then describe about Behemoth and Leviathan. So whatever Behemoth and Leviathan are about relates to this part of God's speech. We've got the setup and then we have the execution. And with this as the center, seeing the proud and humbling them, seeing each proud one and bringing them low, judging them, that's relating back to the second challenge that Job has, basically. The second kind of complaint that he has is that evil is flourishing and God isn't judging people rightly. So, with that, we've got a history of different kinds of interpretive options that have been given forth. And I would say as modern Protestants, and especially within the young earth creation community, we haven't really appreciated what the history of Christendom has thought about these creatures over time because it's actually quite illuminating. We've got three kinds of possibilities. Basically, they're biological creatures of some kind, and that can include the prehistoric reptile that young earth creationists favor, or they could be symbolic of things, or they could also be mythological, right? There's the kind of these three are the ones. And some of these categories overlap a little bit because you can't have a real animal that is also symbolic of something. It can be pulling double duty. And sometimes the symbolic and the mythic blend and overlap a little bit. But generally speaking, mythological and biological are going to be pretty distinct categories, and symbolic is fairly distinct as well. And when we look at the history of the church, what's really interesting is that the earliest perspectives that we have are pretty much all symbolic. There's some who think that Behemoth and Leviathan are real animals as well, but they're also being symbolic. So you've got folks like Origen, for example. Of course, he thought everything was symbolic everywhere.
That's
So
right.
somebody might say, yeah, well that's Origen. It's like, well, yeah, that may be true, but you also have people like Gregory the Great, and he also considered Behemoth and Leviathan symbolic creatures. Um, Let me see. John Chrysostom, he thought they were pulling double duty. He thought that they were probably real animals, but he also definitely thought that they were symbolic. And likewise, you go all the way up through Aquinas, and he's like, yeah, it's the hippo. Or actually, he thought it was the elephant
But
and the whale.
just a
Oh yeah.
clarification, what are the U's, E,
Oh
W?
yeah, yeah. Sorry. So on the slide here, in the column for biological, the different letters refer to what people thought they were, if they
Okay.
were assigning them as biological creatures. E is for elephant and H is for hippo. Those were the two most common perspectives. Elephant especially was considered pretty much the answer for biological until we get to the 1600s. And that's when we have this guy, S. Bochart, that's Samuel Bochart. He was a Frenchman, and he wrote what was called a Hierozoicon. It was a whole compendium of all the animals in the Bible. And he made a very, very powerful argument that Behemoth was a hippo and that Leviathan was a crocodile. And so he was disagreeing with a lot of the folks earlier who thought it was elephant whale. And his arguments were strong enough that most everybody pretty much followed along with him. And he has pretty much colored the discussion ever since. I mean, really impressive, 1663, and we're still talking about basically his argumentation. Then what we have in the symbolic category is whether or not and a person thought that they were symbols, and sometimes we'll see B and L, that's Behemoth and Leviathan, or Behemoth and Leviathan, if, like, for example, this guy in the middle, Ruprecht, he thought that Behemoth was a hippopotamus, but was also symbolic. He thought that Leviathan was mythological, but also symbolic. So that's where you see some of this overlap. But as you look down through, you can see most of the time people think that they're either biological or symbolic or mythological. There's not a whole lot of overlap there. Um,
So what would be the big difference between symbolic and mythological?
That's a great question. So, a good example from this would be, say, Thomas Aquinas, or even Luther as well. Martin Luther thought that Behemoth and Leviathan were symbolic. Aquinas believed that Behemoth was symbolic of sinful, lustful sexual desire. And it's really quite interesting because he spends more time than you'd think talking about the mating habits of elephants uh, and and their lustfulness for one another as a way of saying, listen, that's how these animals behave. And so Behemoth is a bad thing. It symbolizes lust, something that has to be overcome spiritually, that sort of thing. There's a long, long history of viewing Leviathan as symbolic of Satan, right from the get-go, from the very earliest church fathers through to today. The
Mhm.
perspective that Leviathan is actually a symbolic representation of Satan has the longest pedigree of any perspective, probably in Christianity,
Mhm.
and possibly also Judaism. Um, On the other hand, sometimes they're symbolic eschatologically. Another perspective that's very heavy within Judaism of the Second Temple time, around the time of Christ, a little bit before that, is that Behemoth and Leviathan are creatures that are only going to be rediscovered in the end of time. And in fact, the Jews of the time, there were several different writings about this, basically saying that Jews would be able to hunt and kill and consume these animals as a reward for the righteous, faithful remembrance of the law, right? Because the law had all these strict dietary rules, um, the Jews would get to feast upon Behemoth and Leviathan in the end days,
Mhm.
which ended up going in some interesting trajectory because Leviathan is definitely a scaly, watery sort of thing. It looks dragonish, and that would be totally unclean. And so, in the Jewish perspective, there's this gradual shift of looking at Behemoth more and more as a giant fish because a scaly fish is kosher, but a scaly lizard or snake is not. So that's really fascinating to kind of see how that kind of morphs out in Jewish tradition. So those would be some perspectives on symbolic, Satan, lust, other sorts of things. And then mythological would be comparing Behemoth and Leviathan to other ancient Near Eastern mythological creatures. And we're going to see a couple of those, especially Lotan, which is the equivalent creature, quite literally equivalent in terms of its spelling and its description in Canaanite. And we see others like Tiamat in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Behemoth a little bit harder to pin a comparison to because there's nobody else that has kind of the same word that's used. Leviathan and Lotan differ in only one letter between Canaanite and Israelite, for example. But there's some potential connections there that we'll explore.
Yeah. And so, like biblically speaking, obviously it's fine that God is, maybe portraying a mythological creature, like He does elsewhere in Scripture. So I think Leviathan is used for a mythological creature somewhere in Psalms, and which gets slayed by God. And the idea is that this mythological creature that the pagans think is so strong and so powerful, even I who am God can slay that mythological creature. And so just because it's an ancient Near Eastern mythological creature, doesn't mean, when the Bible is using it in the text, that that's wrong in some way. So God can still
Right.
use mythological ideas that He's slaying or destroying, or emphasizing in order to sort of underscore His own sovereignty, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's definite places in the Bible where the biblical authors, under the inspiration of the Spirit, are playing off of the culture, right? And showing how distinct and different Israelite culture and Israel's God, Yahweh, is compared to all of those other things. So you mentioned the Psalms. Yes, we'll get into that a little bit, but yeah, I mean, God makes Leviathan as a plaything. In Psalm 104, we find that Leviathan is frolicking in the ocean out in the ships. Like if you had said that in the ancient Near East to your average Israelite or Canaanite, they would have been like, frolic is not how you describe this thing. It is an ultimate chaos creature. To understand what Lotan, for example, is in their perspective, it is the primal creature. It is one of the two original god beings. It'd be like very equivalent to the things like Gaia and Uranos in Greek mythology. You've got Tiamat and her husband, or Lotan and her husband, as the first two things, and they birth the first generation of gods. And the first generation of gods can't do anything about them. It's their grandkids that end up slaying them and building the foundations of the world out of them, which is again very different from anything that we see in the Bible. So the Israelites definitely were aware of these things, and the authors of Scripture used them from time to time, both in their mythic sense and also sometimes possibly, talking about them biologically,
Yeah.
or reducing them and saying, listen, it's just a created thing. God is, God's not worried about this. In fact, he made it. And again, thinking that like, wait a minute, your God made that thing? You're like, yeah, and it's not what you think it is.
Yeah. So I mean, and I might be getting ahead of myself here, and I'm not sure how you think of that. But as I was looking, I mean, in the past, I've looked at Leviathan. So it is certainly used in its mythological sense in Scripture, but it can be used as an actual creature as well, just as a large, powerful creature. So yeah, it has both senses, and then it's up to us to figure out, well, is it the mythological creature, or is it actually representing a real creature in some way?
Yeah, and for the listeners who might be saying, like, how does the same thing be used in these two different ways? In our own languages, we do this all the time. We have things that we might talk about in a symbolic or hyperbolic way, and we might use the same word to describe something that is mundane. So, part of good exegesis, part of good reading of the Bible is to recognize how the authors are using the terms and the words that they have and what do they mean. So when we find that Leviathan is frolicking out in the ocean, like in the sea, and it's in the discussion of all these other animals, it seems like in that case, Leviathan is like some kind of creature. It's a thing that's out there in the ocean. On the other hand, when in the book of I think Isaiah, when God slays the heads of Leviathan, you're like, heads, plural? I mean, we'll get there, but that seems to be something altogether kind of different.
Right.
So, basically, here are the main trends that we've got. The patristics to the medieval, they viewed Behemoth and Leviathan primarily as symbolic, sometimes blended with real animals, but almost always with symbolic importance for various things. The Enlightenment, all the way through the 20th century, really we see biological dominating. And I think that's because there's kind of this overall pullback away from the mystical, away from the spiritual, and to a more naturalistic perspective, both of the Bible by Christians, but also of the world by people generally, right? A demythologicalization, a desacralization of the world. And views of Behemoth and Leviathan are kind of caught in this train. And it's not really until the 20th century, after some of the other writings of Canaanites and whatnot have been found, that we start to see people, especially with Marvin Pope's very influential commentary from 1975, bring out the mythological and say the mythological is a big deal here. John Day's book about Canaanite mythology in the Bible, he thinks the Bible is borrowing and repackaging a bunch of this stuff. But nonetheless, those are two of the standard bearers for this view. And then in the 20th century, we start to see symbolic perspectives jump back in after a millennium and a half almost. Well, maybe about a half a millennium or more. And now it's basically a rugby scrum. Everything's on the table for perspectives. And in the midst of this, especially in the 20th century, we also, of course, have young Earth creationists following their own kind of tack about, what kind of biological animal are these? So I think the first thing that would be really helpful is to kind of figure out why it is that people would say that Behemoth and Leviathan are biological at all. And there's good arguments for that. There's a reason why this kind of really took the fore during the 16, 17, 18, 1900s. And again, the most common animals that had been mentioned as real candidates before young Earth creationism, especially. So here's some of the reasons why, right? We begin with behold the behemoth, or look at the behemoth, or lo. And the Hebrew word here is very much kind of like, hey, check that out, right? There's like this finger point going on here. Uh, and that the behemoth is something that God said, I made along with you, or I made beside you, or in some way, this is a creature that was made with you. The Hebrew here, I'll have to note, is incredibly challenging. There are parts of the Bible that are really easy to translate. John's epistles are about as straightforward Greek as you can get. There are parts of the Old Testament that are very straightforward. Job is among the hardest. It's very compact poetry. They're using very few words to convey lots of meaning. They're playing off of sounds that we don't pick up when we have our translations. They're using a lot of uncommon and sometimes even unknown words to us. They're found only in this one spot in all of the Bible. Job has the second highest number of single use words in Hebrew in the whole Bible. Um, and it has the highest density. So for the size of the book, it uses the most. And it also tends to use even known words in really obscure ways, highly poetic, stylized ways. And it makes translating these chapters among the most difficult of the entire Bible. It's really, really hard. And having talked with folks who read Job in Hebrew, and they're like, some of these verses are actually impossible. You just have to kind of go with what you think. And sometimes that means that what you think about what the passage is doing will determine how you end up translating a particular verse.
Mhm.
And you don't want to be in that situation, but sometimes that's kind of where you end up. Other good reasons to think that they're biological is that there's all these descriptions of their anatomy. You get discussions about their limbs and about their scales and about their claws and teeth and about where they're living. So there's all these details that seem like you're talking about a real animal. And in the chapter before, Job 38 through the end of 39, that tour of the animal kingdom that God brings Job on is all real animals. Every one of those is a real animal. None of it is mythological. None of it is symbolic. And if there isn't any statement to the contrary, as God goes through into his second speech, he doesn't say, and now I'm going to be hyperbolic. Now I'm going to be symbolic. He doesn't say that. So there's a natural expectation that Behemoth and Leviathan are likewise going to be just like these other things and be real animals. Um, so I think there's good reason why people have come to this kind of conclusion. So, situated within the biological organisms category is this perspective that Behemoth and Leviathan are prehistoric reptiles. Now, I say prehistoric not because I think that they were living before people, right? You and I are young Earth creationists. These would be creatures that are part and parcel of the history of the recent history of the world, right? Recent creation. Um, this perspective actually shows up in the 1830s for the first time, shortly after two of the first three dinosaurs had been named. Oh, I can't remember his name. He was a British guy, and he said maybe Behemoth and Leviathan are Iguanodon and Megalosaurus. So, Iguanodon, a herbivorous giant reptilian dinosaur, and Megalosaurus, he thought at the time was a crocodile, but it, is a dinosaur. So that's interesting. And this is only like maybe 12 years after these things have even been named. So
I
it's
mean,
like you really
I
see
can
it.
actually, I could see why, right? I mean, if you got these older patristic scholars and they're not familiar with dinosaurs, they're trying to come up with the best animal that would fit, and then all of a sudden we find these creatures that actually seem more to fit biologically with what you find in the Book of Job. So I could see why, um, you know, the options that we had weren't really very good options, and all of a sudden there's these other options that actually work a lot better, or at least at that time were considered to work a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, these animals are bigger, than a hippo. They're bigger than a crocodile, or maybe there's some gigantic crocodile, as that's what they were thinking at the time. So yeah, I mean, if Behemoth and Leviathan are the biggest and best things that God has ever created, and you find in the fossil record that there's something bigger than what's living around you, at the time, then you go, okay, maybe it's these, and makes sense. Now, what's interesting is there's a couple of people over the next, century and a half that make this argument, but basically nobody follows it.
Mm.
And I think probably that's in part because a lot of folks think that the Earth is very ancient, and so you have this, wild disconnect between these ancient creatures that died out millions and millions of years ago, and yet you've got a Bronze Age kind of setting for Job. So, like, I don't think, the vast majority of scholars are looking at that with an old Earth in their mind and going, yeah, but it can't be. So,
Right.
so you get like five or six maybe references to this until the young Earth creation revolution begins. And once that happens, the first time we see dinosaurs talked about as potentials is, I think, 1974. And then it snowballs entirely. Um, Very strong anti-creationist by the name of Phil Center. He's a paleontologist, but also has an MDiv. He's Orthodox in his Christian belief, Eastern Orthodox. He actually has an entire paper that goes through every single young Earth creation writing that he could get his hands on about Behemoth, and he clocked in 75 different articles, books, etc. And chalked down, what do you think it is? Sauropod, maybe something else and whatnot. Almost all the time it's a sauropod dinosaur. So that's why these shadows are what they are here. The vast majority of young Earth creationists today think that Behemoth is some kind of large sauropod, the long-necked dinosaurs. And over the past 20 years, there's been kind of a consolidation in perspective that Leviathan is some sort of gigantic extinct crocodilian. Now, to kind of give us some ideas, we don't have time to take a look at 75 different perspectives on it. That's crazy. Center already did all that work. So I'm going to pick three, and I'm picking three for two reasons. The first is Henry Morris's Remarkable Record of Job. This was a book, kind of small commentary that he wrote on Job. And it was very influential on young Earth creationism. And you see the same things that he's talking about in that book still to this day. So there's that long shadow that's cast by Henry Morris. And then the other two papers are by more recent authors that are published, one actually in the theological literature in Bibliotheca Sacra, and another one that's published inside the young Earth creation technical literature. So I chose those two because they're probably the most robust defenses of the prehistoric reptile perspectives that I have seen. There's good other solid ones in young Earth creation. These are the two most recent and two of the most substantive. So moving forward, that's kind of why we're picking these three general and then two really solid scholarly attempts to show that these are consistent with the text of Job. So there's a few things that Morris talks about in this book. He eventually gets to Behemoth and Leviathan around chapter 8 in his book, and he says Behemoth is certainly the largest of all land animals. He says it was a mighty dinosaur. And he then later says that Leviathan is the largest and fiercest of all the aquatic dinosaurs. Now, technically speaking, dinosaurs aren't aquatic, and he probably means something more like some of the big marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and he mentions those elsewhere. But when he's talking about Leviathan and fire breathing, he goes back to dinosaurs that have, various head crests and chambers to do that. But nonetheless, I think that's more of what he likely means. Uh, of course, he also mentions at one point the ugly dinosaur. And I start feeling a little offended as a paleontologist when he does that. But that's like, okay, he didn't think dinosaurs were, he thought that they were terrible beasts in being like really terrible. He hated them. He thought that they were monstrous and monstrosities.
Mhm.
Whereas the word dinosaur, meaning terrible lizard, meant awesome and great and powerful, that sort of thing. So he's got these perspectives, and yet at the same time, it's interesting because Morris is far more flexible and far more nuanced in his perspective of especially Leviathan, because he says that some of the description of Leviathan are literally applicable only to Satan, and that italics comes from him on page 120 of that. So he says, for example, that It was both a real creature and a representation of Satan. So he would have been in the very long tradition of Christianity of saying it can be both of these things. It can be a real creature that Job can see, but it also is a terrible representation, terrifying representation of Satan. And he pulls passages like Isaiah 27:1 and says that there's no way that Leviathan can be a physical entity in Isaiah 27:1. God's defeating it in an eschatological battle. He also says at one point in this portion, thinking about Job 41, and he says basically we're alternating back and forth between learning about a massive and terrible creature and Satan, just back and forth and back and forth. So he really considers this to be God's way of describing Satan by using some sort of fearsome aquatic marine reptile. And he also allows that Behemoth might be symbolic in the same way, but he doesn't really explore that too much. So, what are some of the major arguments that we get for sauropod being Behemoth? This is where we turn to a paper by Paul Lawrence, along with Brian Thomas of ICR and Stephen Taylor. This was the one published in Bibliotheca Sacra. So this is a conservative theological journal. This is not a young Earth creation group,
Mm-hmm.
although obviously they're open to publishing young Earth creation ideas. And these three authors are going to make a concerted effort to show that the description of Behemoth comports with a sauropod identification. And they do their own translation of the passage in Job, of Job 40. And they also compare that to the Masoretic text and to the Latin Vulgate to show, some ways in which these translations are similar and different along the way. So biggest reasons, literally, to refer to Behemoth as a sauropod is the sauropods are the largest of all land animals, and they say that Behemoth is chief in the ways of God, and so that means it's the biggest, it's the largest, most impressive creation that God has ever made. Um, they mention, of course, that Behemoth's tail sways like a cedar tree. And if you know anything about dinosaur anatomy, you know that dinosaur tails, as shown a little bit over here, extend horizontally from the body. They don't droop, they're not held down. And you can kind of see this wedge of tissue here. Let me see actually if I can get my marker over on this. So right over here, we've got this kind of fleshy bit, and that's actually covering over some musculature that connects the femur to the tail. And that means that every time that this leg would step forward, it would pull the tail a little bit to that side. And every time the leg on the opposite side would step forward, it would pull the tail on the other side. So you'd get this swaying motion of the tail every time the animal would walk. Just watch any Jurassic Park World movie, and you're going to see that. And that's modeled very well. They think that tail, like a cedar, is reflective also of its size and its girth, and that if the animal were to rear up on its hind limbs, as some of the sauropods were able to do, then the tail is basically kind of vertical, like a tree. And of course, we've got some other candidates that just don't fit the bill
Mm-hmm.
on that. Any creation book or video or article that talks about this is going to point out that hippos and elephants have these pathetic little rope-like tails with a troll doll tied to the end of it, and they're not majestic. And every commentator that I've read on this, and it's been quite a few, everybody struggles with the tail being like a cedar when they're trying to say that it could be an elephant or it could be a hippopotamus. And sometimes other scholars will even say we just think that they were mistaken. Right? They didn't really even see a hippo or an elephant. They just kind of assumed it had a thick tail. That would be more on your liberal scholar than conservative scholar types, but they'll say things like that. Even paleontologists that you probably remember, Robert Bacher.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Bacher is one of the great all-time great paleontologists. He wrote an article in a geology book about artwork, and he basically comes down and says, yeah, the ancient Hebrew writer never saw an actual elephant. So they were kind of making it up as they go on a couple of things like that.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very interesting article on Behemoth and Leviathan. The other fact that we see is that Behemoth is herbivorous. It eats grass like an ox. it has both hollow and solid bones, limbs like bars of iron and other bones that are like tubes of bronze. So they play that off and say, well, listen, sauropods have all these hollow bones running down through their vertebrae, very, very lightweight, spongy bone. And yet their limb bones are massive, solid columns. So that would comport very nicely with hollow bones and solid limbs. What about Leviathan? Well, notice we've got Brian Thomas over here again, this time writing with Dan Biddle. And this one is in the Creation Research Society Quarterly. They equate Leviathan with the Cretaceous crocodilian called Deinosuchus. And they have a whole bunch of reasons for that. And we'll hit a couple of them. One is that it's the largest of all crocodilians. And since the description of Job looks pretty crocish, but needs to be gigantic, well, here you got a 40 plus foot long crocodilian. That's absolutely terrifying.
Mhm.
They do say that this animal would have been able to perform the classic crocodilian death roll, and they equate that with kind of the wake, the churning of the sea as Leviathan goes away. They talk about the heavy armor that Leviathan has, that it can't be pierced by spines and by spears or arrows or swords. And they also say that, well, modern crocodilians are able to create these mating calls. The males will create these mating calls using infrasonic frequencies that cause the water all around them to just start jumping up and down. And it looks like it's boiling. So maybe this is like the boiling water that looks like ointment or something like that in the description of Leviathan. And then two other components. This came after an interesting study on some new specimens of Deinosuchus that discovered that in the very front end of the snout, in front of the nostrils, there is this empty hole. There's this chamber, and there's a couple of little holes connected to it. And they posit that that chamber might have held a fire-producing organ, because Leviathan breathes out fire and smoke comes from its nostrils. And they think that these openings would have been the means through which the fire and the smoke would have been emitted. So, they're trying to bring in both these cases of Behemoth and Leviathan a lot of anatomy to the fore and say that the anatomy of these animals matches the biblical text of these animals. So I would say for young Earth creation writing, the Lawrence et al. Paper and Thomas and Biddle, these are top tier presentations. This isn't just Behemoth's a dinosaur, isn't it obvious to everybody? No, they're going to try and spell out it's not just obvious. There are reasons to think this. And it's interesting because I didn't set out to do this, but all three of the things that I've surveyed here all come from ICR or ICR staff at some point in their history. Henry Morris and Brian Thomas being on both of these papers. It wasn't intentional, but again, I think that they've done the best job of this at this point.
So just one question. With the previous paper, they were only talking about Behemoth then. They don't talk about Leviathan in that paper.
That's right. Yep. So that one was dedicated to only Behemoth, and the second paper was dedicated just to Leviathan. So, yeah, I don't know if they were planning on submitting something else to Bibliotheca Sacra. The publication date there is 2021, and that journal, like many others, got way behind during COVID. So I think this thing was even supposed to come out a couple of years beforehand,
Mm.
and everything just kind of got gummed up for a while. So they might have switched and gone with some of the creation journals that were able to keep up their publication schedules at those times.
Yeah.
But again, I give them a lot of credit, especially in this one by Lawrence et al. Here they are translating again some of the most difficult Hebrew in the Bible in order to provide a fresh translation, and they don't do a whole lot of argumentation against other perspectives. They have a little bit here and there that says, okay, we think that it's a biological creature. We don't think that it's mythological, for example, but there's like one or maybe two paragraphs about that, and then we're just off, and that's fine. That's fair enough. I might have wanted to see a little bit more interaction with some of the perspectives, but they're kind of just saying, no, we think this is the right genre of biological animal, and if that's the case, is dinosaur, a justifiable position? And they argue yes by all these reasons. And so again, I think that this is a pretty, it's a pretty solid argument that they've made for themselves on it.
Since this podcast has gone longer than I expected, I've gone ahead and split it into 2 parts. So don't forget to join us next time for the second part. I'll make sure it's not too far away. So that's all from me, Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. Don't forget, hit that like button, subscribe. There is a link in the description if you'd like to give. I always appreciate that. Don't forget to pray for Creation Unfolding Ministries, as well as Dr. Marcus Ross and all that he's doing in the creation ministry. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.